these areas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Fleming from Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, panel members, for being here today and your service. This was no question about a disaster, and like any disaster, even though we don't know the precise cause of the blowout, we do know some things happen that are typical of disasters. Because this is a high-risk operation, much like many other things we do, travel in space, flying in airplanes, rarely is one thing the cause of the disaster. It's usually a number of different situations and occurrences and bad decisions that align themselves, which probably over time have occurred, but because of some backup or redundancy, the disaster was prevented. And that can sometimes be a bad thing, because what happens is we become, in your words, complacent. If I make a mistake, there's a backup system that will solve that problem for me. And obviously that's something that on the industry side and on the government side we need to bear in mind going forward. But it was a disaster to Louisiana, my home state, in two ways. One, to our ecology, no question about it, but maybe even worse and longer term in jobs. Louisiana has now lost tens of thousands of jobs because these rigs are so expensive. They have left our shores in some cases, and more will come to go to Brazil and Africa and other places. And you know what's interesting is they're going to other parts of the world that have less standards than we do. So I think that's a real issue we need to look at. Now, the President lifted the moratorium, and I've been researching this. I can't find one single permit for deep water drilling that's been issued since the lifting of the moratorium, and we don't know when they ever will. So what I'm concerned about, and I would like to have your reaction to this, I see recommendations for more legislation, but I think we need to be careful about just moving the chairs on the deck. For one thing, we're asking NOAA to sign off on things, and that's a good thing, but is that going to make the permit process even slower and more difficult? So I'd love to have the reaction from both you gentlemen. Is this really going to get us where we need to be, and how is this going to affect the jobs which are so desperately needed, and finally the price of gasoline and oil that's going up because of the loss in supply?
I would say two things. That I think I would agree with you completely that to the degree that we restrict our own domestic production, we are essentially, given our demand on supply, intending to get more oil and gas from risky places like the Niger Delta or Venezuela. That's a given. And I think we have to take an international perspective on the whole issue, and also recognize that the environment in those places counts too, and it's been very badly abused, particularly in the Niger Delta, some 2,500 accidents over the last 10 years. So that's a perfectly fair point, and I think it's one that ought to underlie our approach to many of these questions. With respect to the moratorium itself, Senator Graham and I were pretty specific early on. We did not understand it, thought that it was excessive, and considered that a more selective approach that did not penalize those companies with good records, particularly once after they had been once been inspected, as they all were in the weeks following the Macondo disaster. Once the few infractions that were found were corrected for, it struck us that it would have been reasonable to resume drilling at that time. But that has not happened. I would say that going forward, to the degree that we continue to understaff, underprepare, underform, underfinance the regulatory agency, we probably are going to find that it is more reluctant to issue permits, less confident about signing a name to a permit, and less able to get us back into business.
Senator, do you have a response?
I would just add that what Bill said at the end happens to be the position of the major petroleum companies in Great Britain, that they actually affirmatively support a strong, well-financed competent regulator as a key part of their ability to do their business. I believe they're right, and I hope that we will come to the same conclusion as to the industry here in the United States.
Can I get a commitment from you gentlemen, and Mr. Riley's already suggested it, that the President not only lift the official moratorium, but actually allow permits, do away with what we have now, which is a de facto moratorium? Would you both agree that the President should move forward and begin to allow the issuance of permits?
Well, as I understand it, and in fact there's a news story today that or at least a primary reason for the delay in issuing permits for those rigs that have met the individual standards, rig by rig, is that the industry has not demonstrated that it has the capability to respond and contain such an event, or if it does, those standards have not yet been incorporated in the permit applications. If that's the case, that actually, in my judgment, is a positive signal that we're now down to essentially one issue. And there also is some indication that the ability to meet that standard of adequate response and containment is near at hand.
Thanks, gentlemen. Mr. Boren, Oklahoma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the members of the Commission for being